Bien, Cristina, vamos al aire. Buena ponencia.
Muy buenas tardes.
Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar organized by the Office of Evaluation and Oversight of the Inter-American Development Bank. Before we start, some housekeeping announcements about our Zoom session. Please keep your microphones on mute if you're not speaking. You can ask your questions and make your comments in the Q&A during this Zoom session, which will be recorded. This event will be in Spanish, and if anyone would like to listen to the simultaneous interpretation into English or Portuguese, please use the globe icon in the lower part of your screen in the Zoom session. The Executive Director for Central America of the IDB, Edna Camacho, won't be able to join us due to some unforeseen circumstances. So we'll hear some remarks by Ivory Young-Protzel, Director of OVE. Thank you very much, Christina, and good morning, everyone. As Director of the Office of Evaluation and Oversight of the Inter-American Development Bank, OVE, I'm very pleased to welcome you to this event that we have organized with the Ministry of National Planning and Economic Policy of Costa Rica, MIDEPLAN. We thank Minister Pilar Garrido from MIDEPLAN and also the director for being at this event, and we thank the MIDEPLAN team for sharing with us the experience and results of the evaluation of international grant cooperation, biodiversity and climate change. We also thank Geeta Batra of the GEF Global Environment Facility, as well as Verónica González, head of the team evaluating IDB action with regard to climate change mitigation and with regard to the comments they will be offering in relation to MIDEPLAN's presentation based on their experience with evaluations in this field. Evaluation is crucial to make evidence-based decisions, and we believe in the transformative role of evaluation to contribute to sustainable growth and equity in the region. OVE has a mandate to facilitate knowledge, good practices, and lessons learned in the field of evaluation across Latin America and the Caribbean. This evaluation, in particular, conducted by MIDEPLAN, is particularly important regionally as the first example of the international cooperation proposed and managed by the recipient country. And this is from the perspective of the country benefiting rather than from the perspective of the donor countries. In addition, this evaluation looks at the efficacy of international cooperation with regard to two key issues, biodiversity and climate change. This evaluation brings major lessons with regard to the management of international cooperation in relation to an issue which is very important and relevant to the current context. Pursuant to our mandate at OVE, we deem it important to share the results of evaluations such as this one in order to further contribute to existing evidence and in order to ensure that future projects can continue to improve to achieve the intended results. Without further ado, thank you very much once again on behalf of OVE, and we welcome our speakers and audience to this event. Thank you very much, Ivory. We now give the floor to the Minister from the Ministry of National Planning and Economic Policy of Costa Rica, Pilar Garrido. Good morning and warm greetings to Ivory and to all those joining us today. For us at MIDEPLAN, it is a great honor to take part in this event, and we would once again like to thank OVE for their support and for the invitation as well to share the results of this evaluation on two matters that are two pillars of national development and major priorities, reflecting the global commitment to climate action and to nature-based solutions and biodiversity. Specifically, biodiversity and climate change are our topics in connection with this evaluation. I would also like to thank the representatives of the GEF, who are among the main donors and cooperating partners in this field, and they have supported us for many years in the hard work to protect the environment and to develop solutions that may be balanced, always with a view to achieving growth without carbon emissions, creating wealth and ensuring better distribution of wealth. We hope the results will be of interest to you. And in terms of the evaluation, which was carried out back in 2017 when it first started, it was a very special process for our country. I remember at the time talking about the in a country like ours, middle to high income country, well, and now a member of the OECD, with significant structural gaps, we had received international cooperation, and we were a country that needed to show how, through the efforts made and considering the fiscal constraints, we wanted to find a way of really showcasing cooperation through leveraging the contributions and actions to be able to stay on a green growth and sustainable development path. Back then, and again, thanks to the support and partnership with the German cooperation, and thanks to the leadership of the International Cooperation Department in rising to this challenge to really ensure that cooperation would enhance the management of international resources on a sustainable basis. We embarked upon this process, which was complex and had its challenges, but it was also essential to be able to really put a focus on sustainability and on the continuity of policies to achieve the SDGs. The main topic for us here is to ensure an alignment vis-a-vis the SDGs, and we have been also making progress with a national development and public investment program, in addition to other efforts such as the national evaluation policy, which seeks to achieve our vision 2030. And as minister in my position, I can only stress the importance of having evidence to make increasingly effective decisions that are increasingly relevant as well and based on evidence. As a middle to high income transition country, we have seen a reduction in international resources from 870 to $432.2 million. And still, we see that the recent commitments undertaken at COP26 have to do with strengthening the climate pact, calling for stronger international cooperation internationally, both in the financial, technological transfer, and capacity building areas. We feel a responsibility to continue to strengthen the evaluation process as one of the pioneering experiences in the region. And as a recipient country, we decided to embark on this evaluation using our own instruments and methodologies. And we have been able to look at the effectiveness of operation in terms of its impact and of knowledge management, and also in terms of institutionalization and ownership with regard to the lessons we have learned through international cooperation. We are truly proud and are committed to further innovating and advancing on this path, hopefully hand in hand with the IDB and finding other opportunities for joint evaluation. For example, the recently signed 3030 strategy to protect our seas from here all the way to Ecuador and Panama, and also payment for environmental services, payment for maritime services. We have actually received an award recently. So thank you for this opportunity, and we hope that the results and findings will allow us to forge alliances and to further make progress on this ongoing learning path, putting at the center of our discussion the importance of international cooperation, especially for transition countries like ours, and especially in areas such as climate action and biodiversity, which are certainly the main sources of a new economy that can be decentralized, digitalized, and decarbonized. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, señora ministra.
Thank you, Madam Minister.
Ahora con la presentación que hará el equipo de MIDEPLAN.
We will now proceed to the presentation by the MIDEPLAN team. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Christina. Thank you very much for this opportunity. We will now present the results of the evaluation, but first, we would like to provide some background to facilitate understanding of the results. MIDEPLAN is a governing entity on international cooperation and evaluation. So the International Cooperation Department decided to include the evaluation as part of the National Evaluation Agenda 2019 to 2022. This is considered to be a disruptive evaluation. It is the first thematic evaluation of this agenda. It's not programmatic. And these topics have been chosen due to the importance of the environmental policy of Costa Rica. It is an external evaluation made possible by the support of the German government that provided financing. And the purpose of the evaluation was to look at the management and results of international grant cooperation with regard to biodiversity and climate change in the period 2010 to 2018, looking at the effectiveness of cooperation, identifying cross-cutting sectors, and looking at the ones that had a high impact in terms of projects. The evaluation was a result of a joint effort by different working teams. We set up a technical team with members of the MIDEPLAN evaluation. You served as technical coordinators in this process, in addition to members of the International Cooperation Plan, which triggered the evaluation, in addition to technical team was set up with officials from the different offices of the Ministry of the Environment and Energy, which is responsible for 56% of cooperation project funds in relation to the topics under review. In addition to the evaluating team, the external team, Red to Red was the consultancy, a binational team comprising an international expert on cooperation and evaluation, a national expert on evaluation, and a national expert on biodiversity and climate change. This timeline shows that this process was not only different in terms of the subject matter of the evaluation, but also in terms of the time it took to carry it out, plus the additional outputs of this process. We started preparing the evaluation in 2018 as reflected by the timeline and presented the results in January of this year. And now we are in the use of evaluation phase. But before starting the evaluation, we had to hire a characterization and behavioral analysis study to identify some general features that could be used in the analysis in delimiting the subject to be evaluated, plus some information that had to be added. Once the evaluation process began, in parallel, we conducted a systematization process, which allowed us to identify challenges, lessons learned, and areas for improvement to be included in our evaluation work as part of the national evaluation agenda, but also giving us an opportunity to share lessons learned with both national and international actors. And that's part of the processes we have been embarking upon in recent months. So although it was an evaluation that took nearly 2 years, it was a very rich process that generated very valuable information for subsequent evaluations, not just in Costa Rica, but throughout the region. Currently, and to provide some more background, we should note that we are in the use of evaluation phase that includes the 4 steps you can see on the slide. Currently, we are reviewing the report recommendations. We have already had an answer from management and are now putting together the action plan, which has to do with finding ways to operationalize the recommendations in the report and to identify the best way to execute them or to carry them out. And this is the current phase. Now, getting into the substance of it, I will introduce Victoria Sanchez-Esteban, who coordinated this process we contracted out. She represents Red to Red, a Spanish consultancy. As we said, this was a binational team. And Victoria Sanchez-Esteban is part of the Spanish team. And we are also joined in the audience by the other 2 evaluators that were also part of the evaluation team. So Victoria, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Carolina. Thank you very much to all of you. I would also like to share a presentation. You should be able to see it on the screen now. As Ina said, the evaluation extended over the course of 2 years, and we as a team stepped in for the second phase. I don't know if you've seen on the timeline that the evaluation started in March 2020, which added another nuance, an evaluation that was planned to include visits and fieldwork had to go virtual throughout the whole process. I remember when we first proposed the methodology, we thought that was going to take 2 or 3 months and that we would even be able to go to Costa Rica to work. But then, of course, as we all know, in practice, the whole process had to virtual evaluation. I won't dwell on the object which already in referred to, but I would add something to what's already been said. This is a thematic evaluation. It was the first one of this kind to be carried out in the context of international cooperation and with the National Evaluation Agency in Costa Rica. Project and program evaluations had been conducted for specific projects and programs, but there had been no joint and comprehensive evaluation of grant cooperation on biodiversity and climate change. Speaking of the cooperation, this was virtual in the end. And although it's true that a lot of previous work had been done in terms of characterization and other studies, and even though the subject matter of the evaluation had been narrowed down quite precisely, we realized that it became necessary to further narrow down the scope of the grants cooperation activities in the context of this study, because here we are looking at the areas that concentrate most of the financing and cooperation in Costa Rica. What does all mean this? It was a challenge, a very interesting challenge. Evaluations, when challenging, help you learn a lot more. Just an overview of what we did. We favored the application of techniques that could work virtually.
al Ministerio de Ambiente y Energía, aunque también iba a muchas otras instituciones, pues también tenían
Although many other agencies were included, they also had programmatic documents on cooperation, or they even had management manuals dealing with how to approach certain projects in this field. So this model was good, but it coexisted with a model that in practice tried to make the most of specific opportunities, sometimes because a cooperating partner could refer to a financing opportunity for a certain activity, and that was then included in the menu for the project. And the question we were asked was to what extent international grant cooperation in Costa Rica in the reference years had been aligned with the country goals in this field, as well as with international agreements that Costa Rica had executed in addition to the sustainable development goals. So the alignment was relative. It was higher in the case of country goals because since 2008, even before the period reviewed and checked for alignment, we found that the alignment was not the same in relation to international agreements or to the SDGs. And there was still a lacking awareness of the importance of the interventions being aligned to the goals, with all that means in terms of ownership and subsequent sustainability of results, among other matters. So this coexistence between a stronger model and another one that somehow weakened the alignment was a reality that we faced. It is also true that if you conducted an evolutionary analysis of the period reviewed, the interventions were becoming increasingly aligned relative to the national goals. What recommendations were made based on this conclusion? On the one hand, to increase project alignment, for which we thought it was more important to do dissemination and awareness raising work with regard to the importance of ensuring alignment, and also warning against the consequences of not doing so, in addition to strengthening and disseminating the forward-looking model. Some institutions might not be aware of it, both within the country as well as outside. If you look at cooperating partners, it is important to disseminate the priorities internally and externally, in addition to the need to make the most of the opportunities that might arise, especially when you consider that Costa Rica has been significantly losing financing as a middle to high income country. And when opportunities did arise, why not make the most of them, as long as that didn't lead to a departure from the strategic path set by the country. Another positive point that we found was that Costa Rica doesn't just have a demand for cooperation, but also a cooperation offer. and specifically with of international cooperation, because on the one hand, it demands cooperation, but on the other hand, it also offers cooperation. And we're looking at triangular and south-south cooperation when we look at the offer side of things. And Costa Rica's international cooperation offer on climate change and biodiversity was robust and orderly. And in the period reviewed, it had become increasingly orderly. So in 2018, we found a lot of progress relative to 2010. And another thing that arose as a recommendation was the need to further enhance south-south and triangular cooperation, which could beautifully add to traditional cooperation. It also being evident that south-south and triangular cooperation does not replace financial or technical cooperation of a more traditional kind. Some of the advantages in Costa Rica's experience with regard to south-south and triangular experience was the increased learnings and good practices. In other words, the activities had boosted results, also allowed for the sharing of experiences, and also sped up some innovations. The next conclusion, and by the way, there were several evaluation questions regarding the cooperation management system in the field of biodiversity and climate change, although here it wasn't as relevant because the system was similar in most cases. It was shared with other sectors, but there were quite a few questions that had to do with the cooperation management system in the country. And what we found was that the management system had become systematized and stronger over the years, but it still needed improvement. And we will see the improvements here in relation to the recommendations. On the one hand, we needed to improve interagency coordination, which we recognized as a problem at the time, and interinstitutional coordination at different levels specifically. On the one hand, in terms of the management of the cooperation. In the case of Costa Rica, it's the Ministry of Planning and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that are involved. But there was also an issue relating to coordination among and within institutions. A number of institutional liaisons had been defined at the different offices dealing with climate change and biodiversity, and often there were coordination problems between the liaisons and the institutions they worked for or in. So that clearly needed to be improved on. And we also needed to enhance familiarity and knowledge with regard to grant international cooperation. At MIDEPLAN and in the International Cooperation Office, there's a database, CIGESI, a broad database, which is a repository of key information on international cooperation, but which the agents or officials that had to send cooperation information, they thought there was a lot of red tape involved and that it didn't really add value. And in practice, sometimes the procedure was skipped and CIGESI was therefore not complete. Sometimes it wasn't even updated. And it's also true that originally the plan and the mission was to have all public international cooperation. But of course, this was not the same at the different institutional levels. Perhaps you could have it at the central level, but at the more local level, there was no guarantee that the information was duly identifying all of the possible cooperation.
So how could we increase the CIGESI? As I was saying, we had to update it, and above all, it had to be useful for everyone, for users, so that all users would be able to obtain a value to be able to receive and send information. We have to see if this is feasible or to do something directly. Something that truly was very pleasing is that our plan was improving in this direction. Another issue that we had to improve upon on these terms was that we had to abide by the procedures. Costa Rica had a series of procedures. And in practice, this was not something that was always being done. So this was one of the consequences of the fact that CIGESI did not have all the necessary information. There were institutions who just were not sending information on the projects that were being developed, but they were sending it, but not through the normal channels. And this used to take up a long time. It was true, it was a very serious problem, and it was lived as such by MIDEPLAN, but it was very focused on very few institutions. And so this is a strategy whereby those institutions can start to align for all of those procedures. Then there were other issues. I'm not going to dwell on them. The declaration of certain concepts, and no one was very sure about co-financing or if these were national donations or not. I'm not going to dwell on this, as I said earlier, but the information was not complete, and the information that we had, because there was supposed to be support information in when the project had been worked on. So everything had to be ready, the budgetary aspects. And in practice, this was not available. We also were able to see that the level of quality of the final reports were about 40%, 40 or 50%. It was about half of the cases of the projects that were there. And in practice, this was not being done. So we were seeing the activities, but not the results that stemmed from these activities. And we needed to improve all this. It was also very important to follow up and evaluation. In the case of following up, there was no clear regulation, the regulation that has to be abided by the planning rules that cover international projects. And there were issues that at a global level just were not defined. In the case of the projects, if this has been defined, then it has to be fulfilled based on these activities. But there are many institutions that were not recognizing this. In the case of the specific evaluation, we found that the evaluation had other issues, and this is part in what was being said, and that people were saying, oh, this is very important. But then when you went to hard facts, what they were telling us, and these were statements, because we weren't getting the information, they were saying that about 64% of the people responsible for projects whom they spoke with said that they had done the evaluation, but in practice, in MIDEPLAN's database, there were only 25 reports, and out of these, about half of them did not have the quality in order to be considered as evaluation, fully fledged evaluation reports. But what we will see is that this was happening with a number of other elements, and I will talk about this further on. On the other hand, they also recognize that this many times was not published, so it was difficult to use them because they were not published, and it was difficult to have these. So the agents were all in agreement in saying that we had to promote this execution so that the people in Costa Rica could do this. They recognized that when they had external people working, the agility and the efficiency improved, but on the other hand, there was less transparency and there was less control. And they also believed that this was important for the country in terms of appropriation, of ownership, so that these projects, in terms of execution, could be improved. But in terms of execution, they could be done by
Costa Rican institutions, but they also said this also means that the people who are heading these projects have to be fully committed. They mustn't be working on other projects. They should have the specialists that are needed in order to fulfill the job well. The fourth conclusion was that in these projects, we found that there wasn't enough information on the type of partnerships, and many times transversely, it was more an anecdotal type of reporting. And in this management system, they were following the principles of cooperation on a global scale. So those were the guidelines that had been worked upon. In other words, in terms of partnerships, we saw the same thing, what I just mentioned. And again, partnerships are very important. We used to say this, but they weren't there. And transversely, it was also the same thing in terms of gender. Now, when this was being formulated, we had to find the necessary indicators defined by sex. There were activities for women, activities for men, and this, of course, the gender issue was something that was spoken about, but it was something that had to be learned. So the monitoring reports in many instances were not mentioned. This topic was not mentioned. So all of these issues are present in the design for the execution. Now, in terms of participation, there was a specific analysis, and in certain occasions, they did define technical and decision-making committees, but then they only remained as consultative committees. There was no other.
Es muy importante que estos proyectos cuenten con la participación de diferentes agentes, de la sociedad civil, del sector privado, etcétera, etcétera. En el fondo, o sea, lo que planteábamos como recomendación.
Well, what we were saying as a recommendation was that it was worth increasing participation and joint management
en el diseño, en la ejecución,
in design and disseminating as well the activities, and also with regard to the closing. The thing is that the evaluation by different actors showed that the presence of civil society increased the alignment of interventions, also in terms of sustainability. And when the private sector was present, sustainability also improved, as well as the subsequent scalability possibilities. And when you had a population, you could also enhance ownership. And with regard to gender mainstreaming and participation, of course, it's important to enhance this. Many of these issues have different nuances. For example, climate change doesn't affect men and women in exactly the same way, but we think that if this is made a requirement from the outset, we won't be able to achieve that much. So it would be better to raise awareness and train.
Many of these focuses were not part of this because they didn't really know how to manage them. There was another question on the harmonization between the partners. We found that the harmonization, the predictability in terms of resources and transparency and accountability, this was much better. There were cooperation initiatives amongst all these entities, but there was really no institutional harmonization. What we did find, and it was interesting to note, that the global funds are a formula for harmonization, in as much that in one manner you have access to these funds that come from different places. It's also true that there are access conditions that are also a little more complex, and they require a greater effort when you are making a proposal. So there were certain initiatives for improvement, for there to be a more complementary way of working, to have added value. And we found that all of this was also part of the issues. In terms of predictability, it really had to do with cooperation more than on a general level, more than on a multilateral level. Costa Rica can always improve this, because when you speak with all the people that are involved in the problem, in the project, they say, well, this is what we can do, this is what we cannot do. But when you ask the people in the country, they always say, no, we need more, we need some more very specific issues, and we require more information. What can be done in this case in terms of recommendations? One thing that I also wanted to say is that there are a number of differences amongst all of the cooperating parties. This is why we weren't speaking about transparency being improved objectively. More than anything, it had to do with the various needs within the Costa Rican institutions. But what we do believe is important and that can be improved is the position of the country and those changes that can satisfy those needs that were expressed by the very institutions. And who would be able to do that? We believe that this could be done at the highest levels of people who have responsibilities, the people that are the managing entities, and all of the other cooperating bodies. Very well, then, we do need all this, and we have to work in this direction. Another issue on is how are we including biodiversity and climate change within other topics and other issues. We saw that there were certain examples. But in the examples that were provided, they were out of the temporary timeline. They had started in 2018. They were only starting. And yes, it did seem that they would be able to work transversely in topics that regarded commerce or industry and so on, and that there would be this vision in terms of climate change and biodiversity, but nothing further was done. We do believe that the agents remarked on something that was important. You have to make sure that these themes, that these topics must be stimulated, but keeping the country as a whole in mind. Climate change, biodiversity in Costa Rica is something very important. Of course, it's important for every single country, but specifically for Costa Rica, this is a strategic type of activity well beyond economic activity. And for many reasons, therefore, it's important that there be a specific position for the country so that we can make sure that biodiversity and climate change are transversal in a coherent manner. There were other agents that didn't have a clear picture of what we were talking about in terms of these topics. They didn't know how to apply any of this. It happened as happened with gender. This is something that had not been contemplated, and they needed application tools. So aside from stimulating that presence, there had to be more practicality in order to make sure that this was something that happened in actual fact. Now, in terms of results, what happened was that we had to perform an analysis of the project, but there was a lot of documentation lacking. We came up with a sample. It wasn't exactly the sample that we were hoping for, but we had to include a variable of the lack of information. We didn't always have contact with the people that had headed the projects. They were not, it's not that we didn't want to contact them, we just simply didn't have that contact information. So it was very important to have the documented information and the final reports, as well as the evaluations when they existed. So in the end, we ended up with 38 projects. Yes, they did include all of the information, and they were quite thorough. We could analyze them. With these projects, we knew that we had something very positive. It was something very worthwhile because they were complete and they could be taken into account. we did find that the projects that we analyzed did not fulfill those goals. We always detected aspects that could be improved upon, but in a general fashion, they did, in general terms, reach their goals. We also could see that it was important to increase the complementary nature of these projects and their coherence. And this is related to the organization of all the actors, to make sure that there was a transversal organization of all actors. We were told that not only were we talking about the government, but other instances, other agencies that were working in new territories. So you reach the territory and you find that a certain institution, the UNEP, for example, there were all sorts of institutions are performing a project that is very similar to ours. Either we compete for the beneficiary, or we reach an agreement, we change somewhat what we need to change in order to be able to have a wider reach and to have a better effect in terms of the project. But this is something that has to be improved upon. It has been identified as such. What happens on the field? What happens on the field is that they realize all this. These are different actors that know themselves and they can reach an agreement. And if this is done beforehand, then this can generate a greater reach and better efficiency. On the other hand, we'd have to improve on the management capabilities of the people responsible for the project. This is something that is quite common, not only in this evaluation. There are many people that are at the heading projects. They don't know exactly what the difference is between the project itself, a result, a product, but they don't really know how to reach these results, or they start on the wrong foot because they don't have the information or the necessary training. How to be able to prepare final reports that include all of these elements. So we've learned all this, and they have to learn this themselves to be able to provide the results that we are looking for. This is what we needed to improve on as well. We were also talking about strengthening the factors that favor appropriation and sustainability. In this case, this is the recommendation, and it was linked to the conclusions. We found these conclusions that were viable before we realized that we had to base the projects very solidly. They had to be aligned on evidence. It's not that we found projects that didn't really have a basis, but there are many things that I'm not commenting on because this was a very far-reaching evaluation. During the first few years, many of the projects that were fulfilled, the objective was to set the strategies and the policies for the country in terms of the environment. And those projects didn't really have the right orientation when they had to be defined. Now that we've done all this work and we've had all this progress, it's very important that the basis of these projects is solid with everything we've been able to build and with all the knowledge that we've been able to accrue. Then in terms of the political, institutional, and thematic alignment is important. This will make sure that we are able to fulfill all of the items that make up the project. And then we also have to make sure that there is an organization of the different agents, the follow-up projects, the follow-up schemes. And in the during portion, we found that it was very important to include the participatory structures. When they became part of the project, they had to be co-responsible, and they needed to make sure that the interest groups were included as well. We noticed that if this was done, then the project was much more solid and much more successful. If there's a greater appropriation, a greater greater ownership, there will be better sustainability. We needed to incorporate all kinds of measures that led to institutional strengthening, and we're talking about the population at large, the civil society. So it's important also to remember that this has to be part of the entire process. We also found what is part of the last point. Now, the third point has to do with strengthening institutions in order to be able to make sure that these projects can be utilized at a later date. Many of these areas don't have the resources required. A strategy is designed, and then the resources, the technical resources aren't even there. I'm not talking about financial resources. I'm talking about the technical resources in order to be able to apply all this. There were instances in which we were told that they didn't even have a good internet connection that allowed them to take part in the various meetings and so on. So these, we believe that with small investments, we'd be able to permeate the territory much better. And lastly, for the after portion, we saw that it was very important to, in terms of the final result, it was very important to disseminate and favor access to the products and results in order to scale it up. We wanted to make sure that the products were there, they had to be tangible products, but in order to request them, you had to know that they existed. So we needed to disseminate information on the existence of these projects. So this was a very important part of the after. For the agents that are interested, we're not talking about academia, we're talking about students, ONGs, even not the biggest ones, those entities that can reach higher or other audiences. And then we needed to preserve what the learnings that had been achieved. This is basically a good management of knowledge. Sometimes the people who headed these projects withdraw, they're no longer there. So it's important to have more of a cascade reaction. We want people to be able to have access to this information. There were people, for instance, who had retired, who'd stopped working, and no one was aware of this, or perhaps they didn't know where the products were or what had happened with all those results. So remember that we had been doing the evaluation since 2010, and now we were talking about 2020. We were talking within a timeline of 10 years. And of course, there's always many changes within 10 years. Then it's also important, you must remember that it was perceived as being very important that execution, the material execution of this work be done by institutions within the country. We also realized that this at times was not possible because it had to do with our partners. But in the fact that we could have a coordinator, a liaison, so that the project can continue, these are all learnings. These are things that have to be learned, and the country understands this so that the institutions can slowly but surely become part of this process. I have a feeling that there's so many other things that I could have said. I have to tell you that there was a very wide evaluation that was performed within a year, but I believe that for now, for the time being, this is more than enough. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the MIDEPLAN colleagues and to Victoria Sanchez. Now we have the Chief Officer for Evaluation and the person in charge of the environment for the IDB, Geeta Batra.
Thank you very much. Let me put this in full screen. Yeah. So thank you all very much. I'm sorry I'm doing this in English and not in Spanish, so let me give you time to turn your translation button on. But thank you for giving me the opportunity to discuss this, I think, very comprehensive and well done study on technical assistance in biodiversity and climate change in Costa Rica. As I was listening to the findings, having read the report as well, it resonates so much with what we have found in environmental evaluation at the GEF Independent Evaluation Office. So I'm going to provide my comments more from the perspective of the Evaluation Office of the GEF, which I represent. As you know, GEF is the Global Environment Facility, is the financial mechanism for the conventions on both biological diversity, as well as climate change, land degradation, chemicals and waste, Minamata, Stockholm Conventions as well. As Minister Pilar pointed out, GEF has had a very long engagement and a very active and productive engagement in Costa Rica. The GEF has completed about 40 projects. The total portfolio of closed projects is about 50 million, but the total investment has been about 100 million with more than 230 million in co-financing. So it's a pretty large portfolio for the size of Costa Rica. And as the Minister Pilar pointed out, it's mainly in biodiversity and in climate change. Now, we found that the projects are very relevant and aligned with the country's strategies. Now, recognizing, and as this evaluation has also pointed out, that addressing the drivers of environmental degradation requires that one work across focal areas. And not exclusively within a particular focal area like climate change or biodiversity. And as a result of this, the share of multifocal projects and integrated projects has increased over time, even in Costa Rica. I'm very happy to note and inform you that actually the success rates of GEF projects in Costa Rica are very, very high. You have 90% of the projects with very successful outcomes compared to the overall GEF average of about 80%. Sustainability is also very high at 70% relative to the GEF portfolio of about 64%. And 85% have very good implementation outcomes. So it's a very impressive track record of investment and of environmental projects in Costa Rica. I think you're all quite familiar with this, but I think we have tracked this project now for many, many years. And so I thought I'd bring this up more as an example that resonates with what you have found in this evaluation. This is the payment for environmental services, ecosystem services that was launched in the early 2000s in Costa Rica. It was mainly aimed at fostering biodiversity conservation. The outcomes were really, really good. This was at a time it was launched when deforestation rates were very high. 66% of deforestation was avoided as a result. And the project moved from 0 hectares under the system to over 296,000 hectares. More importantly, you had a biodiversity trust fund that was created. But above all, what worked? What did we find important factors that drove success in these projects, which are now continued over more than 15 years? Stakeholder engagement, good government support, civil society engagement and support, technical capacity, good policy frameworks, and adaptation and learning. So nothing of what I'm saying is new because you've just heard it and it resonates with the findings of this evaluation that's just been presented today. So what does this mean in terms of implications for programs? Again, as I'm just synthesizing what you've already heard through this evaluation, but we've of course done it across a very broad spectrum of over 5,000 projects covered at the GEF so far. And in fact, we've recently released the 7th comprehensive evaluation of the GEF because, as you know, the GEF Trust Fund is just undergoing its entered its 8th replenishment period. So a greater need for addressing the drivers of environmental degradation. This is a must. Integration across the different focal areas. You know, you've got chemicals and waste also, you've got international waters, as was pointed out. So what's the best way of harmonizing and integrating across all these different areas? And the GEF has made quite a bit of progress in this in the last 3 replenishment periods. Better monitoring of outcomes, including synergies and
supervisión de los resultados, incluyendo las sinergias y las compensaciones, porque a veces
the other thing is recognizing
el
also
otro
the
aspecto
interrelationships between environment and socioeconomic co-benefits. Because as the SDGs have pointed out, it's not just environment and it's not just socioeconomic. These two need to be brought together, and that has to be measured as well. And finally, taking things to scale, and this evaluation also pointed that out, requires private sector engagement. The COP26 was all about how do you bring the private sector and mobilize private investment. Now we've done a lot of work in this area, and it's not one of GEF's success areas. Private sector engagement has been difficult. It's been difficult for the GEF. It's been difficult for a lot of governments. And so deliberate efforts need to be undertaken in this area. And the first one is there a common understanding of the environmental issues, challenges, and the way you can address them? What we found is actually just communicating more and communicating what will work and promoting that understanding between the private sector and government is a big step in that direction. The other thing is you cannot do a one-size-fits-all approach, right? So SMEs will work very differently in climate change compared to large corporates. So having a tailor-made approach to intervening with various private sector entities is really critical. And of course, you know, going forward, coming out of this green, onto a green recovery process will require attention to inclusion. So all policies will have to make sure that they are based on the principles of inclusion. So we can't just blame programs, and we can't just tell, you know, program staff, this is what you need to do. Evaluation also has certain responsibilities associated with this. So what does this mean? We have to learn, how do we evaluate integration? How do we know that these cross-integration programs work, and how can we inform programs on this? How do we capture environmental and socioeconomic co-benefits? We always tell development practitioners, you don't take interest in the environment. And we tell environmental practitioners, well, environment is all important, you know, you don't have to worry about socioeconomic. But we've got to bring these two together, even in the context of evaluation. So that's important. We've got to incentivize candid evaluation, right? So not to penalize people if they say this is not working, and there are other ways of doing things. So we've got to improve the way we actually incentivize evaluation. And a criticism we at the GEF evaluation office often hear is, well, we've progressed ahead. Your evaluation is always looking backwards. So we are embarking on more and more real-time formative evaluations where we can give as soon as possible feedback on how programs are actually working so that it's more useful and programs can actually adapt. And finally, you know, the emphasis on learning is not just for organizations, it's also for evaluators. So my last slide is, I think this evaluation did a very good job in adapting to COVID. We've all had to learn, and Ivory's also mentioned this a few times, mixed methods, relying more on geospatial approaches. The amount of data that's available versus through satellite data today is immense, especially in environmental. Biodiversity, tracking deforestation, you can have real-time tracking of what's happening now. Using a lot of the socioeconomic data, the IDB puts out, the World Bank puts out, you can integrate this information with environmental attributes. And most importantly, we all have very good evaluative evidence. How do we bring it together, right? The tendency we have as evaluators is as though nobody's ever done this before. This is the first time we're doing this evaluation, but that's not true. There's a lot of evidence out there. There's a lot of good work out there. Our job is also, how can we bring that together and use it? So in conclusion, I would like to say I haven't added anything new because the evaluation has done such a good job, but I hope that I've only helped to reinforce the findings of this evaluation based on a very large body of evidence, not just for Costa Rica, but also based on other countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Geeta. Muchas gracias a Geeta Batra. Le damos la palabra ahora a nuestra colega de OVE, Verónica González Diez, jefe
Verónica González Diez, team leader for the last evaluation of the IDB regarding adaptation and climate change. Thank you very much, Christina, and good afternoon. I will now share my presentation.
Disculpe.
Sorry about that. Can you see the presentation? Yes, brilliant. So thank you very much for the invitation to take part in this webinar on the results of the first evaluation of international cooperation on climate change and biodiversity in Costa Rica. I would like to take advantage of this opportunity to tell you a little bit about OVE's experience evaluating climate change, since this is very similar to the exercise led by MIDEPLAN, both in terms of the challenges we came across in the evaluation, as well as in terms of finding. First of all, I suppose for background, the first thing we should mention is that climate change is relatively recent for multilaterals. At the IDB in 2007, the Sustainable Energy and Climate Change Initiative was launched with ordinary capital funds and multi-donor fund resources, which is the way the IDB launches a new area of intervention. In 2010, the 9th General Capital Increase decided that climate change would become an institutional priority among the 5 priorities that the bank had at the time, setting 25% as the share of financing approvals. And later, we had the first integrated strategy in 2011 for mitigation and adaptation. And in 2016, with the Bahamas resolution, we increased the financing target. OVE conducted the first climate change evaluation in 2014. The evaluation sought to document efforts that the institution was already making in terms of learnings, but also results obtained so far regarding commitments under the 9th replenishment. And the evaluation included a portfolio review and a sample of projects and publications, case studies in relevant cases, field studies in 11 countries. That is the privilege of having worked before the pandemic. Costa Rica was one of the countries visited during this evaluation. The evaluation period was made broad enough so as to be able to see the change before and after the initiative, and the operations that specifically had climate change or co-benefits as goals were included. The challenges we encountered in this evaluation are very similar to the ones I see the Costa Rica evaluation came across. The first challenge was building the climate change portfolio in the absence of a classification system for climate change operations. I think the evaluation for Costa Rica referred to the lack of consistency among databases, and we face the same problem. We had a database from one division, from another one, they didn't match, so we had to engage in a whole process there, and the multilaterals were doing harmonization for the green financing classification system, but this was only available as from 2012. So we had to do the whole retrospective exercise, validate that. And another thing we came across that was very important and was also mentioned by Geeta with regard to Jeff is that the IDB group projects clearly identified the benefits linked to socioeconomic development, but hardly ever the co-benefits linked to climate change. So we used a classification system which, let's say, adapted what had been developed as part of the NDBs and systematically identified projects in terms of co-benefits, so projects that have socioeconomic benefits, such as increasing agricultural productivity. And if the instrument or tool for improvement was a soil management system as part of climate change adaptation strategies, we included that. So it was an enormous amount of work simply to identify what the database of the project that we would be using would be. So that's the same problem you face, I believe. And the second point, very similar to Costa Rica as well, had more to do with an institutional challenge related to climate change as a cross-cutting area. And we found this not only in the countries, but in the IDB. We had no climate change unit, and the counterparty was no longer the traditional one, the Ministry of Energy. We also needed to include other agents. There were other institutional arrangements, and there were also some challenges with regard to alignment, which we found in the Costa Rica evaluation too. And finally, one of the key issues here, I think this has to do with grant cooperation generally. In very few instances are results of technical cooperation documented. In this case, we have a lot of technical cooperation for institutional strengthening and knowledge generation, and that was a major constraint for our evaluation, as was the case with Costa Rica. In addition to the evaluation methods to measure the impact of knowledge products with regard to policy formulation or policy decision-making process, we didn't find strong methods to measure that impact. Another similarity vis-a-vis Costa Rica, which has a lot to do with the incipient development of adaptation policies and strategies, has to do with the fact that most of the climate change finance portfolio went into mitigation, especially energy. There was a huge bias, and from the outset, our first initiative was renewable energies and climate change. But it was very interesting to see that although energy wasn't one of the major contributors in terms of climate change mitigation, none of the renewable energy projects talked about climate change relative to the SDGs. Adaptation was 20% of the portfolio, mainly agriculture. And in the case of agriculture, no project actually had a focus on adaptation or resilience. Sorry, could you put up the PowerPoint presentation in presentation mode? There we go. Is it gone? Yep, it's gone. For a moment, perhaps Luis could give us a hand. Sorry, Veronica, if you've got two screens where it says slideshow, you may want to remove the notes.
O lo puede volver a proyectar y también le guiamos desde la proyección.
Or you can again put it up on the screen and we can guide you.
Si quieren, puedo ya estaba terminando, entonces sí.
Well, I was about to finish anyway, so yeah, just go ahead. So I can just wrap it up. I was talking about one of the similarities relative to Costa Rica, which had to do with the fact that most of it was mitigation and very little adaptation. And another important thing that we identified in the OVE evaluation was the fact that the projects were much more reactive than proactive. There was no actual tool to identify climate risk, which meant that I think the Costa Rica evaluation talked about circumstantial opportunities. There were lots of them, not only for investment projects and the private sector and renewables, but also for policy reform projects. And I also wanted to share some of the conclusions that are also in line with the ones for the Costa Rica evaluation. Actually, the IDB had expanded an operations portfolio, but there was a need to strengthen the evaluation monitoring and the rating systems, and policy dialogue and support for adaptation needed to be reinforced. Very little had been done. Also regarding expansion of the knowledge base and institutional strengthening, the information limitations regarding knowledge products and also institutional strengthening, that was a major constraint for the evaluation. So no substantial conclusions were extracted. And regarding the private sector, there was very little coordination between private and public. And OVE found, in other words, we identified potential gains to be derived from public-private cooperation. For instance, in the field of energy, when you're financing a reform along with the government, and at the same time, the private arm is investing in the first projects as a result of the reform. Finally, mainstreaming during the evaluation period, that was one of the areas with least progress. And climate change, you mentioned this earlier, was not duly reflected in sector strategies or in the energy sector or transport sector or in natural disaster risk. There wasn't really a mainstreaming of the issues. Same thing with the country strategies that hadn't mainstreamed these topics, and well, let alone the loan operations. This evaluation dates back to 2014, and we followed up on the recommendations until last year. And the IDB made significant progress on a number of fronts. Classification, that has been fully harmonized. Also, there has been significant progress in mainstreaming, although it's not 100% yet. And I dare say we will continue to make progress, since our president at the last COP said that the bank will have a 100% climate resilient and carbon neutral net zero portfolio. So I can say that I haven't contributed any novelties, but definitely by reading the evaluation, this very much resonated in terms of the Costa Rican evaluation, which had a lot in common with our own work. I just wanted to share that. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Verónica. We will now move on to our Q&A, so you can ask any questions if you feel like asking any of our colleagues. I picked up one. They asked the MIDEPLAN team if they're considering the possibility of a similar evaluation for another sector or thematic area in light of the result of this recent evaluation. Well, perhaps I'll pick that up, and of course my colleagues can expand. We have our national evaluation agenda, and there's a set of evaluations we have conducted that's available on our webpage. We have working quite a bit. We have been working also on adaptation policy and would like to make progress with some multilateral in terms of payments for environmental services while trying to generate inputs regarding payments for environmental services to better defend and protect and to come up with nature-based solutions. The sea is obviously a source of wealth, what with the blue economy, and we're also, I think, at the door. Well, we will have a new administration coming up soon, so we'll have a new evaluation agenda and public investment and development plan. We're pretty certain there will be new interventions, and of course, I invite you to keep an eye on what we're doing to be up to date. Obviously, take into account our agenda, our sector goals for 2050, our territorial management program. We have a lot of efforts underway. Thank you very much, Madam Minister. Would anyone else like to speak? I think the minister said it very well regarding expectations, and considering the new year, we're starting already with preparations, and there is a whole plan with the Climate Change Office. There's another evaluation coming up for next year, and there's also an opportunity linked to the development of the new evaluations agenda, which will start to be worked on next year, which will provide an opportunity to include new evaluations of this kind, tailored to sector needs as well. Thank you very much, Carolina.
If I could add, the GEF IEO would welcome the opportunity to work and partner with you know, such evaluation units in looking at, for example, if GEF projects are involved, deep diving into them to understand. So please, let's, you know, stay in touch and think about ways in which we could also collaborate. We're very happy, as you know, Carlos Manuel Rodriguez is the new CEO of the GEF from Costa Rica, and he is extremely keen and interested in evaluation. And he spends a lot of time discussing independent evaluation with us. So, you know, if there are any opportunities to collaborate, we would welcome it. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias. Sin duda vamos a tomar en cuenta.
Thank you so much. We'll definitely take note of that.
To strengthen our ties and to build up on mutual efforts in order to strengthen our evaluation agenda on biodiversity and climate change. So perhaps adaptation would be one of those areas where it would be very key to have the intervention of and the support of you. So thank you very much.
Perfecto, muchas gracias a todos.
Excellent, thank you all very much. We just have a few minutes left. So if there are no further questions or comments, we would like to thank each and every one of you very much for your participation. Thanks to the speakers and the experts and the audience. Thank you all for your valuable participation and time. We'll soon be sharing the recordings of the webinar in all 3 languages through Oversight and the other websites, and we'll be including the list of participants. So thank you once again. Have a great afternoon.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Un abrazo, gracias.
Muchas gracias.